So the 1920s, the politics of the 1920s is in many ways almost like a return to the Gilded Age, that age in the Industrial Revolution of the United States that witnessed a government who sought to oversee sort of the smooth running of business, of a government that did not seek to really represent the well-being or the interest of workers or consumers, but rather macroeconomics and the interest of business. And so in a way, the 1920s was sort of a return to that attitude, the attitude of the Gilded Age. There's 3 Republican presidents in the 1920s. One of them is pictured here. This is Warren G. Harding, who died in office in 1923. Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and then Herbert Hoover. These presidents were really reacting to the Progressive Era. The Progressive Era was a period of time that really sought to control business and control economics, and to do so largely for, if you will, the greater good of society. You control business and you break up trust to promote small business sort of enterprise, to protect workers' wages and or the cost of goods for consumers. You try to control the economics more so bankers don't hold sway over the economy, and so that the government can have a greater role in sort of adjusting interest rates and the currency to a relative degree, and to also tax those that are the wealthiest so as to improve the economic situation for the country as a whole and for individuals in the working and middle class sectors of society. The presidents of the 1920s, again, were sort of returning to a like Gilded Age era. They want to sort of revolt from these ideas of the Progressive Era and instead promote rugged individualism on the level of the American individual, meaning that they're not going to see their job as intervening in favor of workers on a labor dispute. They're not going to see their responsibility to be passing laws and regulations that are designed to benefit everyday individuals in the working and middle classes. Instead, they see their job as to protect business, allow the prosperity of business, the economic prosperity of business, under the idea that that would result in a greater economic benefit for everyone in the country. And so as a result of this, you see in the 1920s a political attitude centered around really being hands-off when it comes to, if you will, helping workers or helping middle-class individuals in the United States through government actions, but helping business and corporations in the United States through a process of deregulation, meaning getting rid of the laws and restrictions that might impede the full profitability of a corporation. So they effectively seek to deregulate aspects of the economy and to remain hands-off when it comes to the role of the government in the realm of the individual. How do 1920s progressive or presidents revolt from the progressive programs of the 3 presidents who preceded them? How do they revolt from the progressive programs of Roosevelt, of Taft, and of Wilson? I think somebody has their mic unmuted. Can you mute the mic, please? Thank you. The way they do is quite, there's a lot of words here, but the way that you see presidents of the 20s revolt from progressive programs is in a way it's sort of common sense. They put people in positions of power within the government who share their interests. So in the Secretary of the Interior or the Interior Department, they appoint Albert Fall to be Secretary of Interior. The purpose of the Interior was basically to oversee the environmental conservation programs that were originally put in place by folks like Theodore Roosevelt. Albert Fall was an anti-conservationist. So you put a person in power in that part of your cabinet, of that part of the executive branch of the federal government, to oversee the Department of the Interior, who doesn't really embrace the principles that progressive individuals had seen to be the role of the Department of the Interior in the post-Theodore Roosevelt era. Secretary of Treasury, Mellon, which is, of course, where the name Carnegie Mellon University comes from in Pittsburgh, you had a real kind of trickle-down economic approach from the Treasury Department. You see a cutting of taxes for the wealthiest people, and it's important to note that very few people would have paid income taxes in the progressive era, and even less in the 20s. So the people paying income taxes, the income tax, of course, brought into being under the presidency of Woodrow Wilson, the income tax taxed a few thousand people. And during the 20s, those taxes are cut further under the leadership of the Treasury Secretary, Mellon, in the Treasury Department. The tax burden is, to a larger degree, sort of like placed on the middle class. With that said, because it's coupled with sort of deregulating parts of the economy, you did see a lowering in the federal deficit during the 1920s, though individual debt goes up. And that was a problem at this time that will ultimately lead to, or at least contribute to, the Great Depression. President Warren G. Harding was, because of his presidential power to appoint the Supreme Court, justices of the Supreme Court, Warren G. Harding actually was able to appoint 4 of the 9 Supreme Court justices in a one-term presidency, which was a lot. There were vacated seats, and of course the Supreme Court's job is to oversee and rule on matters of constitutionality, to determine what laws are and are not constitutional. And so having a lot of justices appointed that might share your interpretive perspective on the power and responsibilities of the federal government could really be important when it comes to altering laws that are in place. And during this period of time, you will see the Supreme Court put down some of the progressive era child labor laws. You also see antitrust laws. Those are the laws that were used to break up monopolies. Antitrust laws are largely ignored during the 1920s. And the ICC, which stands for the Interstate Commerce Commission, was manned by individuals that were sympathetic to the railroad trusts and the railroad lobby. The Interstate Commerce Commission is basically the thing that gave the federal government the constitutional power to say it has the power to regulate things that cross interstate lines. The railroads generally cross state lines, and as a result of that, when it came to matters like meat inspection and these types of things, it was that fact that really gave the federal government the right to say they had the power to regulate and control these entities. Well, now you have sort of, again, a sort of return to the era of the Gilded Age, and you see the Interstate Commerce Commission manned by individuals, peopled by individuals who were ultimately sympathetic to the railroad lobby and not really sympathetic to a lot of those antitrust laws. During this period of time, and sort of a product of some of the things that I just mentioned, you witness a real rise in corruption in the United States. Warren G. Harding, in the executive level, Warren G. Harding's presidency is generally regarded as the most corrupt presidency since that of Ulysses S. Grant, who again was probably not himself corrupt, but just simply appointed people who had their own initiatives and were themselves corrupt and engaging in activities that he did not do a great job overseeing. And you might say it was a similar case for Warren G. Harding. Under Warren G. Harding's presidency, the United States witnessed one of the worst White House scandals in the history of the United States, and certainly in the 20th century, right up there with scandals like the Watergate scandal, for example, under Richard Nixon. And this was called the Teapot Dome scandal, and you see this political cartoon sort of depicting this scandal. The Teapot Dome scandal, it's called Teapot Dome because Teapot Dome was one of the locations where the federal government conserved oil reserves for the U.S. Navy. There were oil reserves in Wyoming and California that were basically they were controlled by the U.S. Navy, and they were being controlled and conserved. Again, this is sort of in the vein of the conservationist policies of the former progressive president Theodore Roosevelt. They were being protected so that the Navy could use them if they needed them. Well, the Interior Secretary Albert Fall sought a bribe, effectively was paid $100,000, which was upwards of $1 million for those of us thinking in the 21st century. So he received roughly around what today would amount to about $1 million, a little bit more than $1 million. Actually, I think it's closer to $2 million to allow a private corporate entity to begin to extract and sell the oil from these federally protected naval oil reserves. And it was a huge scandal, and ultimately Albert Fall was arrested and convicted, and he served jail time for this. The 1920s, to give us a larger perspective of where this goes in terms of the development of the Great Depression and then the reaction of the government during the 1930s. The Great Depression, of course, happens in 1929, where it really is associated with beginning in 1929, though the roots of the Great Depression, as we will talk about, are much deeper than that. The 1920s and the 1930s, and I think you would also say, you could make this argument about the Progressive era, had two different philosophies when it came to economics and society. Here you see President Calvin Coolidge, who was the president after Warren G. Harding. Coolidge was sometimes referred to as Silent Cal. He was noted for being not a person of many words, but a person who very much believed in sort of a less regulated capitalist economic system. So very much opposed many of the ideas of the progressive era. And Calvin Coolidge, like Warren G. Harding, like Herbert Hoover, oversaw a program that centered on deregulation of corporations, deregulation of industry, lowering of taxes on the wealthiest and corporations. And the goal here, this is what might be called trickle-down economics. The goal here, the thinking here, is that deregulation and lower taxes on corporations and the wealthy will result in an economic boom. And the economic boom will then result in more pay, more money, more wages and earnings for working people and middle-class people. That's generally referred to as trickle-down economics. After the Great Depression occurs in 1929, the 1930s really centered on increasing regulation, higher taxes on wealthy individuals and corporations. And the idea with increasing regulations, taxing wealthy individuals and corporations more, was largely to, one, make the economic and banking and business world more stable, to provide greater security to working class and middle class individuals, as well as providing employment through the government to put out-of-work individuals to work using both deficit spending as well as tax revenue to fund those programs, as well as to create unemployment insurance, Social Security, and other types of programs designed to improve the conditions for working and middle-class Americans in the United States. So we see from the 20s to the 30s, you see very distinct sort of difference in philosophy, with the 20s being centered really on what might be called trickle-down economics, which was the idea that you deregulate rules on corporations and banks and markets, and you lower taxes on the wealthy and the corporations, with the idea being that it will stimulate economic growth, and that economic growth will be to the benefit of the country, the economy, and of workers and the middle class as a whole. After the Great Depression begins, I should say, in earnest in 1929, the philosophy of the 1930s was very much that there should be increased regulation of banks, markets, these types of things, tax corporations and wealthy individuals higher, and put more sort of incentive around creating greater security and stability and greater sort of wages for workers and middle-class individuals in the United States. Much of the 1930s, too, is driven by the idea of sort of stimulus spending, that the United States could spend on the deficit as long as it wasn't out of control, and use that ability to fluctuate the currency of the country, to employ people, to put greater money in the hands of consumers, allowing them to spend money and buy the products that make a mass consumer economy turn. So in the 1930s, the myriad of employment programs that centered around Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal were largely centered on Keynesian, sometimes it's called Keynesian economics, or controlled deficit spending, to use government spending to put greater money in the pockets of consumers and workers, to provide greater employment for workers at reasonable wages, so that they can spend money and stimulate the economy, a consumer economy, by putting that money back into the economy. And we'll be talking more about that as we move forward in our discussion of the Great Depression and the New Deal.